Okay, I guess we'll get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Miles from Books Against Borders. Welcome today to our talk about fractured race, class, gender, and the hatred of identity politics with Michael Richmond and Alex Charnley. Just out from Pluto Press last week. It's a fantastic book exploring a really interesting set of different histories and the kind of disputing the way in which identity politics has been utilized by both the left and the right and disparaged, and looking at kind of the importance of these different intersectional and, the different ways that identities are formed and have always been present within class politics and politics more generally. Thanks a lot, Alex and Michael, for coming. Books Against Borders, just before we begin, Books Against Borders is a education abolitionist and anti-colonial educational collective in which we do discussions like these. We have reading groups, and both online and in person, and we will be holding a few various different events over the next few months, so keep an eye out for that. We're always open for new people to get involved and always really excited about new ideas. So if you would like to get involved with us, you can contact us on Twitter or Instagram, or find our WordPress or our email, which is booksagainstborders@gmail.com. Yeah, cool. So as I said, today we're going to be discussing this really wonderful book, Fractured. Alex and Michael, thank you so much for coming here. I'm going to pass over to Dom now to talk a bit about the book and open up with our questions. Before we begin, I do also want to say that this is, as I said, a very collective approach, and we really hope that people feel comfortable bringing in their own thoughts, questions, comments. If you would like to share your thoughts, or if you want to ask any questions, there will be plenty of time for that. You can post questions in the chat or put your hand up and get involved. And this meeting, or this is also being recorded and will be up on YouTube eventually, so just something to be conscious of if you want to show your face or not, if you want to ask questions. Cool. I will pass over to Dominic. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so I'm just going to summarize a few of the ideas quickly and then move on to questions. But just to reiterate what Miles said, please jump in with any questions, put them in the chat if you want us to ask them. So I guess the backdrop to the argument of the book is that, there have been conservative applications of identity politics, and these have been used by the right, the centre, and the left as well, in this sort of a neoliberal age. The collapse of liberal democracies have created a deepening of historical social divisions. It's what the authors would call fractures. Identity politics being very loosely defined and applied by people across the political persuasions to explain socio-political divisions. So instead, the authors argue that in viewing race and gender not as detached cultural identities apart from class, but integrated aspects of class formation, we can begin to understand the multifaceted ways in which class formation has been made and remade during the history of racial capitalism. And therefore, through this, we're to build deep coalitions of solidarity and organization, to build our own revolutionary times, and to transform the social relations and systems of oppression. We must avoid blaming difficulties with regard to class composition on a divisive identity politics, and instead embrace class's richness and vastness. So the book covers like the original concept of identity politics is explored, the work and lived experience of Black feminists in the United States and Britain, the nation state, nationalism and borders historically, looking at Jewish workers in Edwardian Britain and Chinese workers in 19th century California. They use this to demonstrate how modern border controls were first constructed. Later on, there's exploration of racist violence, again drawing parallels between the past and the present, with a focus on how riots of whiteness work in tandem with the state to pass racist legislation, increase the oppressive state powers. And the book is tied together by this idea of revolutionary times, in which movements of the oppressed gain the upper hand. So first of all, I guess, just dealing with lived experience. You know, you draw on the Combahee River Collective. You state that, you know, the most radical politics can come out of our identities, although you then go on to state this is only because the collective were dialoguing with a militant intellectual tradition. Could you sort of elaborate, I guess, on your understandings on the importance of personal lived experience and identity in developing revolutionary subjectivities in sort of movements and organizing?
Yeah, shall I start, Mike? Well, I just want to say, first of all, thanks so much, Dominic and Miles, for bringing us on here. And thanks, Dominic, for the best summary of the book I've ever heard.
Should we just go home?
Should we go? Because that was absolutely beautifully clarified, and I hope we can be as articulate as the talk goes on. Yeah, I think in terms of personal experience, one of the themes of the introduction, as you say, is to look at how what identity is supposed to mean, how it's been instrumentalized across the political spectrum. And one of the ways is that your personal identity is kind of suspect. You know, identity itself as a term is a very slippery notion in a kind of social media era where everybody has to kind of present themselves, you know, with a certain avatar as a certain kind of personality online. But that's only extending really from a liberal democratic sphere that selects and recruits people into the public sphere to speak on behalf of groups. So I think you've got this issue of representationalism in the liberal democratic sphere that makes people suspicious, often rightly, and we kind of go into ways that happens. But identity politics became a schema really to explain that, and it was heavily weighted not towards any kind of personal experience, but especially the personal experience of, say, Black revolutions or Black feminist thought, or any kind of politics that seemed to stray from class making itself central, if not class, a more general kind of politics, a politics of a broad universal, what appears a broad universal kind of purpose. And on the left, that was quite decisively explained as identity groups forming around civil rights, around Black liberation politics, around queer politics, around feminist politics, being a politics of a gesture or a kind of gestural lived experience, or utilizing lived experience to kind of bully or manipulate kind of the public sphere, and kind of demonstrate that that's been incorporated somehow by, you know, politicians like Hillary Clinton in the US, who has said, well, you know, class politics can't end violence against women, for example, or made kind of those kind of commentaries. And often what you get is these reactionary formations in liberal democratic public sphere and its kind of imagery present these kind of arguments. And then that can be rounded on the left as another example of a defunct identity politics. And what our argument is really is that there is no politics that doesn't have personal experience and as at the kind of center of it, you know. So in a sense, it's a defense of particular experiences and the quality of experiences and what those experiences are dialoguing with. That's very different to a liberal democratic sphere that's constantly utilizing everything, you know, that's instrumentalizing all experiences and subduing the quality of concrete experience to kind of form certain positions or strategic attacks in that kind of sphere. And a kind of argument in the introduction is, well, the emphasis has been on that, reacting to that, and reacting to that kind of reification of experience has created a reaction in itself, you know, a kind of anti-identity politics, common sense, you know, a common sense that any kind of politics, it seems to kind of wear the stigmata of Clinton or, you know, of antiracism or queer politics, or is a kind of social justice agenda, or a kind of woke capitalism, all these kind of things that evolve from it. So yeah, I don't know, Mick, you want to, our emphasis really then is to move on to, well, what is, you know, what were the kind of debates and arguments of Black feminism in the US and the UK, not just the US, because obviously it's exceptionalized around the US often, and kind of get into that, like what was the quality of the struggles, and really kind of wait on the historical side to see how contested really and how intersectional on a kind of quite organic level any kind of political struggle is. What do you reckon, Mike? That's kind of...
Yeah, I think, you know, we go into quite a lot of detail in the second and third chapters around the kind of ideas and organizing practices of Black feminists in each country, and you know, I think in some ways, because this is where the term is coined in the kind of within 1970s black feminist movements with the Combined River Collective, this is kind of seen as a kind of origin point. But we wanted to kind of show that whilst it was coined then, it was also, it had deeper roots. So we wanted to go back and look at the work of Claudia Jones in the 1940s and 50s, particularly her writings then, and further back in terms of the kind of interventions being made by Black women in the United States kind of context in sort of 19th century movements and debates, as a way of trying to show that these kind of these necessitations for autonomous organizing and for particular interventions by people who are particularly categorized or identified in particular ways are not new today, and they also weren't new when identity politics as a term gets coined, and that these the necessity to kind of organize and to constitute collectively as a group in this way is necessitated by the kinds of erasures and oppressions that are constantly being reproduced, not only by the state, but also within broader movements. And so we see that, you know, the kind of drive towards autonomy in the 1960s and 70s is partially, you know, for Black feminism is yes, it's a reaction against some of the exclusions and kind of unaddressed patriarchal forms in Black power, as well as the kind of sense of not belonging or not being made to belong in white feminist movements, and I think we try and stretch though that kind of the realities of certain groups needing to do that. We try and stretch that back further to say that you know, that the claim made against identity politics in this kind of loose, baggy kind of sort of non-distinct way of talking about it is to say that it is generally kind of a means of either kind of splitting the class from a left perspective, that it's a means of splitting the class, or it's a kind of a wrecking politics. It's a liberal politics because it focuses either on kind of individual progression or on you know, things that are kind of somehow less of a priority. And so yeah, we try and show how these different kind of drives to create, to kind of claim a universality of different kinds, whether it's a universality of the class or a universality of the nation or a universality of democracy, or from various different kind of political traditions, all have a kind of drive to kind of blame those who seek autonomy or redress of some kind for basically causing trouble, for troubling those kind of political communities.
Yeah, so just sort of that's interesting. Just sort of building on that idea of universality or this assumed commonality. How is that at play today, would you say? And I guess thinking about recent movements, like obviously, I guess Black Lives Matter, how successful have they, do you think, been in challenging some of these ideas?
I think it's it's a hard one to kind of answer how successful they've been, because I suppose there's a lot going in that movement itself. Say if we talk about BLM in 2020, it was a sequence. So there's a rebellion and there's kind of cop stations on fire. And then you had, as we cover in chapter 1, we have the statues being overturned, and we look at that in context and Bristol and see the kind of reaction to that at the level of the state. So it's ushering a response really from the state, which are quite panicked, which is quite panicked response. This is how we kind of read it, especially in Britain. And so I suppose we're not looking whether it's successful in troubling those universalities, because obviously within that movement, there's reductionist paradigms of what Black Lives Matter is as well. And they become kind of elevated, if you like, as representative of the whole movement, of like the rebellion, of all this different kind of sequence that kind of happened. And politicians will then, and right-wing politicians will look for the kind of lowest common denominator about what Black Lives Matter is, or those discourses, and do that. But I think it's worth kind of thinking about like the kind of intervention that did, and how that troubled, in the context of like the Colston statue as a kind of public historical intervention, how it troubled the universality of Britain, of the idea of Britain being a we, a kind of a national paradigm that's not just for the right, but it's being very important for the left, and the idea of labourism and a workers' movement that's British. And it really did trouble that, and it continues to, and the abolitionist thought really has kind of picked up momentum as part of that wave of struggles. And it's become, I think, a kind of a more greater ingrained question around the left of what the nation is, of what the context of a national social movement or a kind of revolt against Britain would be, as well as capital, and not the idea of an innocent, say, British state, just talking about the British context now, being overrun by capital, which is, I would say, part of major consensus to politics on the left previously, that through austerity, it was very common to hear that the British state was kind of like a ship in a storm, that was kind of being attacked by global capital and kind of financialization, that needed to be kind of rescued and collectivized back to some kind of previous era of stability. And I think after Black Lives Matter, there was a lot of kind of public questioning. There was a recovery of histories and anti-racist histories that's shown that there's always been an anti-imperialist quality to Black struggles and Black liberation struggles in the UK, as well as the US. So in a sense, what's been successful is that it's forced, I think, a lot of the left to consider, what the mainstream politics has been, left politics, and if that's been successful, it has the idea of kind of organizing for a better left-wing government or a better left-wing state had the kind of success that was aimed for. And what's the trouble with that, and how did that kind of, those movements like struggle? And partly was around national questions. That's kind of, they got defeated really, because to being recruited and incorporated to defend a national interest, which is a cross-class interest. So I think that debate is ongoing and it's a process. And I think a lot of abolitionist thought that's emerging is continuing to trouble these things. The issue is that there's always, on the left as well, a reaction to this. And I think in the midst of Black Lives Matter in 2020, when there's a massive upsurge, there's a lot of quietness around these former critiques of identity politics, or that anti-racism in itself in the whole is, you know, just kind of a reactionary neoliberal kind of consensus, because the mass movement, the mass kind of scale of it, the force of the rebellion over George Floyd had such an extent, there was a quietness to it. But when that kind of quieted down, that momentum, then it was back again, if you like. You know, those critiques came back, and it's like, look, you know, that's failed. That insurrection was spontaneous. It's got no longevity. So you have these kind of reactions coming up in areas of defeat and areas of ascendancy. And, you know, I think what we're trying to do really in the book is look at that and ask why that keeps recoiling, you know, this sense of defending a previous orthodoxy of the left and not kind of encouraging more historical introspection about why the left's weak. And it's not because of these movements, it's because the left in both the US and the UK has been incorporated in state structures, including the labour movement. So, you know, I think that's what the quality intervention is for me. I don't know whether you'd call it a success or not. It just kind of is what it is. And it's trying to analyse kind of what that is. What do you reckon, Mike? I mean, do you think about that?
I mean, I think like the way that we try and talk about movements is as movements which are all continually kind of struggling with their own composition problems, and that this is just a kind of constant of all movements. And so you know, Black Lives Matter, the kind of the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others would confront these same kind of peaks and troughs of other uprisings that we've lived through and before, and that they are in lots of ways part of a kind of continuum of struggle. And I think that, you know, we try and talk, in the book we refer to this concept of revolutionary time, which was we got it from a book by David Rodiger, the Labour historian in the United States, who wrote a book called Seizing Freedom, which was about the mass movement of enslaved people who rose up to free themselves in the US Civil War, and how that kind of act of self-emancipation is largely kind of erased in the kind of historical retelling of that war. And he, you know, talks about revolutionary time as this kind of having this this quality of having an uprising that changes people's sense of what's possible and changing people's experience of time. And we talked about that same history, that same civil war that he talks about in the book, but we also, you know, applied that the same idea. I don't think it's Rodiger's idea originally. I think it was developed by historians of the French Revolution, but we find it compelling because in a sense, I think we've kind of lived through some of those peaks and troughs in our own kind of political lives in the last 10 years, where, you know, the Arab Spring, for example, once that kind of created this domino that allowed others to kind of see that it was that something else was possible, and I think that we certainly saw that with BLM in 2020, where, you know, you had a place like Portland basically in open insurrection for half a year, more or less. Now, like in terms of people wanting to see like a kind of, you know, a balance sheet of like successes from the movement. Well, no, it's not led to the abolition of the police, but in terms of kind of like a true demonstration of power. You know, we talk about demonstrations. The idea of demonstrations in the past was to demonstrate the power of the class or the kind of collectivity that's being oppressed. Well, that was a true demonstration of power. And whilst there can be desolation in the crushing of it afterwards, there is also the kind of institutional memory within movements of what people had done in the past, what people have done previously and can do again.
And I think, yeah, just to follow up from that, I think that's what chapter 1's trying to do in a way, is just to try and kind of go over that again and remember it, and kind of remember that it wasn't some kind of fudgy moment. It had a sequence. There was kind of moments of uprising, there was moments of quiet, there's moments of incorporation, there was moments of reaction, and to remember all those moments, you know, and that should be the kind of modality of analysis we should apply to all moments of revolutionary time, really, or a kind of where something happens that creates this kind of sense of quickening. It's because something really is happening there, and there's a lot of forces, not just on the right or as part of the state, but in the left as well, that want to forget that want to kind of like put it to one side and say that was some kind of weird spontaneity, that was, you know, neoliberal subjectivity, all of these kind of things. And so I think that became one of the motivations really, with whenever we're looking at something, to look at historically, try to look at sequences and try to give a fuller context. So there's something that's kind of held there, and we're not caught in these very degrading kind of recuperation arguments that, you know, it happened, it's recuperated again. And, you know, it's kind of fatalistic arguments that I think are quite comforting. You know, it can be quite comforting for people to everything fails, you know, it's just failed again, just like it did before. And, you know, there's maybe a lot of there's a bit of kudos to have of that. Like, you can be a great critic that's kind of always on top of it, you know, kind of. So certainly I think that was in our mind's eye, really, is to kind of push back against that kind of reflex.
I think we were really keen to push back on the kind of regularity with which the kind of the claim of recuperation being leveled by people who kind of emphasized a kind of more orthodox or traditional labor movement or left party approach. So the claim of recuperation against certain social movements, against kind of anti-racist movements seem to continually lack a kind of self-critical and historical lens on the recuperation that continually happens within the politics that they affirm. Like, we try in the book to show how constant the kind of recuperation of individuals from workers' movements, from trade unions, into ruling class positions, into kind of a kind of state affirming politics that doesn't seem to count as recuperation.
And the point there, I think, before the point of that is to say, well, you know, what's better kind of probably understood as representationalism is in all political movements, there's always a problem and a force. It's not a kind of something to write off some movements against others, or kind of, you know, create a universality in imagery around one movement and then a particularism around another. Always we should be looking at how that happens, you know, and that's what black feminist movements are doing with white feminism, and looking at how kind of imperialist feminist arguments became institutionalized around the state, you know, around our, you know, so, you know, I think that is it really, is to kind of not to say, well, this is a successful movement and this isn't, and kind of create, you know, be forced into a balance sheet or to defend the successes even, but to say, well, all movements are under these kind of pressures. In what way, you know, and like what and how what analysis will become important to understanding that, so movements can be stronger later. Do you know what I mean? There's kind of like a practical, you know, it's a practical necessity to that. Whereas a fatalistic kind of, well, there you go, you know, I'm going to tell you how this movement failed, and there's some of the kind of pathologies around that, and be very kind of high-minded, will do kind of, is individualistic in itself, I suppose. It's kind of do well for your own kudos as a kind of a theorist of culture or something, or a critical theorist, but it won't really do much for movements trying to struggle and kind of move through those, you know, through those problems.
Yeah, sorry, there's a lot to think about there. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, I do have a follow-up, but yeah, I'm interested also in Neha's question in the chat. Neha, would you like to read this out yourself, or do you want us to?
Yeah, sure. Well, what I commented on really was, so I'm doing a PhD on race podcasting and social media, but I'm looking specifically at the British context. And one of the frustrations I found is that when we talk about racism, we kind of tend to transpose directly anti-racism from the US and apply it to Britain, which then kind of, as I say in the comment, allows it to fall prey to the criticisms that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So my question was more about, like, why do you think, it's particularly Black British feminism, I think, has been drowned out? I think you know, people know of the, you know, Paul Gilroy and of David Olusoga, but Black British feminism seems to kind of not really have the voice that Black feminism does in the US. And I was wondering if you could or would be able to comment on why you think that might be the case.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure you with your research would know more or as much as us, but I have probably a couple of ideas. I think in the book we talk about how in general the way that kind of educational policy in Britain, with regards to kind of a kind of very flattened and kind of empty kind of approach to sort of diversity, I suppose, that tends to focus around American histories and neglects almost entirely the struggles of racialized people in Britain and those rich histories, as well as the struggles of colonized people against the British Empire. So I think that's something that contributes to it, and contributes to the sense of kind of sort of white innocence that is so kind of prevalent across various kind of political traditions and sort of institutional discourses. I think that in the US, there was a more concerted opening among sections of the feminist movement to Black feminist perspectives. By no means perfect, and in some ways that kind of that encounter can blunt some of the perspectives that were offered by Black feminists in earlier periods, but nonetheless it meant that there was a mainstreaming, I suppose, of important Black feminist perspectives in a way that was just not really present within white feminism, and the particular kind of gatekeeping and kind of sort of liberal kind of sort of columnist based kind of white feminism of the 90s and noughties. And I think just the kind of the whiteness of the left and of mainstream left institutions, I think just in general, you know, that it might have, I think in general has been awful in terms of kind of race literacy, and in terms of incorporating long histories of kind of anti-racist struggle, and including Black feminist perspectives, into kind of more like wide-ranging kind of just basic left histories and left ideas, partly because those perspectives, I think, are just as powerful at kind of challenging and undermining aspects of today's left as they were when those institutions of the left were much more explicitly excluding Black and Asian people in the 50s, 60s and 70s.
And I think just to add to that, I mean, one of the things we look at in the reaction to BLM 2020 in chapter 1 is the way there's this actual sense of like, why is it happening here? This is a US problem, I think Keir Starmer said, who originally knelt for George Floyd, said, well, I was kneeling for George Floyd specifically. George Floyd and what happened to him, not for this movement that's over here. What's this doing? And a lot of the ideas that this was a kind of an American kind of hijack created some of the new agendas in Britain, following on from the US around critical race theory being present in schools, and that actually what's systemic is a kind of anti-racism in Britain that's some kind of derivative from the US. So in a weird way, a lot of the ways under the Blair period, the New Labour period, where a lot of work was done to, as Mike said, kind of create this very flattened sense of diversity and kind of soft focus around multiculturalism, which came with a kind of a very aggressive motifs, i.e., yes, we want multiculturalism in Britain, but we will kind of follow and people who kind of digress from that through the war on terror and all of this. So it wasn't, it wasn't kind of as if it was, as it's sometimes described to be, a period where it was really great for diversity. It wasn't. It was a very instrumentalized form that was kind of taught. But a lot of that kind of, I suppose, a lot of the work that was done there was to destroy the kind of potential for more public awareness of the kind of the British anti-racist movements and a lot of the anti-Black violence of the police. That kind of with Stephen Lawrence, and that was what it was doing really. I think, and and then once this happened with BLM 220, I suppose then there's a space to go, oh, we've never had a problem in race in Britain, which is kind of what the response was, because a lot of this work was done to kind of create a sense in which racism was kind of formally ended, and there was kind of a more multicultural horizon. And in that kind of instrumentalized way. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, yeah, I definitely would agree. I definitely think that there has been I don't know the right phrase, but a drowning out of anti-racism in Britain. And I think reading Shivanandan's book was really very enlightening as to how much has been kind of erased from British anti-racism. And in particular, I think, Mike, you were commenting on the left kind of not being very attentive to it. More so even, I think what Shivanandan was arguing was that the left is actually being part of the problem, and have deliberately kind of undermined and hijacked anti-racism within the UK. And I think also, what both of you are saying is that there is this constant narrative, I think, throughout the world. Even I partly grew up in Australia, and I heard the same narrative in Australia, that we are not America, we're better than America, which is particularly ironic in Australia, given they're a settler colony, predicated on the right of, white British settlers. So I do think globally there is this narrative that America is the worst, and the rest of the world is sort of, we should be grateful we're not America.
Definitely.
Definitely have had similar experiences. And this kind of, it's not just white innocence. I mean, you do hear this from other places as well, but certainly that kind of white innocence and that kind of universal we does a lot of work in doing that. And you mentioned the kind of border and its role in doing that, with reference to Nadine El-Anani's book, which I think makes that argument really well, that there's this kind of, the entitlement and the whole, essentially a nationalized version of the wages of whiteness. And particularly within the trade union movement that you kind of dissect as well. I think that's really, eye-opening, I suppose, also to how that has been persistent in worker movements and the left. On that kind of theme, towards the end of your book, I've lost the page, which is great. So you talk about, again, this kind of the role of this universal we, or this kind of the issue of there's not kind of the way that capitalism is always this continuous thing and also standing still, and that it's not kind of building up to this, stages of history or kind of universal catastrophe. And I suppose in that kind of framing of it, it really made me think about climate crisis, because this is kind of often nowadays is kind of presented as the ultimate universal catastrophe, right? This is and the responses to that really awkward, often paradoxical mix of this is a universal catastrophe that we're going to solve with our individual consumers changes. But I suppose what it really made me think about, again, coming back to this idea of the wages of whiteness that is tied to, is that flattening out also really functions to flatten out the responsibility and the benefits that people take from that in the first place. So it's not just that we need to identify the fragmentation of these different oppressions and conditions, but that also entails understanding of how people and different groups have benefited from that unequally, right? And I suppose particularly with the climate, I was thinking about things like Extinction Rebellion saying that we can get the police on our side, right? That sort of, there's just this maybe a historical or historically illiterate, I don't know, understanding of both how these different institutions function and how different groups benefit from them. I suppose, what do you think? I do think that education plays a really pivotal role in doing that and addressing that history, but ultimately it means people confronting the ways that they have benefited from the exploitation of others, and beyond more than that. What do I know this is a very historical text, but in terms of going forward, where do you feel there is this potential for the kind of radical re-understanding of history that is required, and for people to actually confront that and really appreciate how they need to, basically lose what they have gained from these oppressions?
Are you gonna go, Mike?
All right, I'll go. So I think in the book we referred to like the kind of toppling of Colston as like a public history lesson, and I think it's that those kinds of actions with emphasis on the action can be a more effective form of sort of radical political education than even if you got like a tiny module put onto the curriculum and taught it around the kind of country. I think that a lot of the kind of the ability to kind of shift people's kind of worldview and shift their politics and their consciousness takes place much more, like that's part of what revolutionary time I think refers to. I mean, of course, like it's not, you can't always know clearly when you're in one, and you can't always wait around for there to be a revolutionary time, although every time revolutionary time does not just refer to spontaneity. All uprisings that have ever happened have also involved sort of past struggles and sort of long, boring and painstaking forms of organizing as well. But I think that those kind of I think that it is within struggle that things can shift, and I think that I've witnessed that happening. I think I even see it on social media with all the people who I follow who are, you know, a generation younger than me, and how much like a lot of them are way ahead of where most of us were when we were that age. I think is partly because of the struggles that they've lived through, and partly because some of the, you know, some of the sort of structural kind of things have maybe meant that, you know, a kind of proletarianizing of middle class strata has also contributed to that as well. I've forgotten what else I was going to say, so you go, Alex.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in the reference to environmentalism, I suppose, because I mean, certainly everything you've said there, I agree with, Miles, and it's been very frustrating to see lots of people obviously going into something like Extinction Rebellion and some of those actions that are kind of anti-working class actions, really, and often racist, you know, kind of putting up adverts in working class areas with live multiculture and kind of creating kind of certain guilt trips around a job. So they are really frustrating, but then you see even movement within that movement where there are actually some better actions. And, you know, I think recently, you know, the kind of the private charter flights, you know, focusing on private charter flights, kind of that action, the support of the RMT, and an XR group went down there to support an RMT picket and workers on strike, sorry. So there's kind of development there, but I do feel like we kind of made a concerted thing not to turn it towards or frame it within current our environmentalist movements. So I think that if there's a strong environmentalist movement that's anti-imperialist and anti-racist, a lot of these problems would really go away, and there would be a lot better strategic perspective to get kind of good actions all the time. So definitely I feel like I don't know enough about the internal stuff of what's going on in environmentalist movements to kind of know what's happening there. But I think there's potential with new generations of abolitionists to kind of intervene there, actually, and start to kind of, you know, present what is essentially about what capitalism is. And it's kind of capitalism isn't a kind of universalized thing. There's kind of a regime of underdevelopment, and also people move across nations as well. I mean, one of the issues, I suppose, with, well, look, we've benefited here from these exploitations and from the underdevelopment of these countries, is that we're still potentially talking in country national terms about who's kind of benefiting, when there's people moving into countries like Britain. And certainly in Black feminist work and writing in the 70s, they were from a perspective of migration, that there was Black women in the core, in the imperialist core, that weren't having these benefits of the post-war welfare state, and Black women working and creating the post-war welfare state. So there's already these kind of tiering of labor within the core. So I don't know, I mean, it's kind of feels to me like you need to trouble the idea of, although it's very true that British society, let's call it, has developed kind of unequal exchange and benefited from it, and we need to keep that as a kind of mode of analysis. It's important to like look at what areas of Britain just do, you know, they don't kind of, you can't say that they benefit, you know, that they've benefited at all. And often there's areas in Britain geographically and racially segregated that haven't benefited from this, that are part of this kind of environmental context and its racialization. So that, and you know, I think there have been actions like Heathrow action and stuff that kind of intervened and kind of presented that. But yeah, I do feel kind of optimistic that as more movements emerge, which they will, almost simultaneously, that you'll get more of these encounters. I don't know what you think. No, that's kind of my feeling about it.
Like, I think, you know, when you were talking, Miles, in the question about like the kind of, you know, apocalypse not being experienced universally, it reminded me of like me and the way me and Alex met was because we made a newspaper together for several years, and at a certain point it stopped being a kind of newspaper with like numbered issues, and it became kind of theme based. And one of the themes that we did was apocalypse, or maybe it was called Apocalypse Now. And we actually interviewed via email. We interviewed Silvia Federici. And I won't tell you my embarrassing story where I completely like showed myself up on email. But we, you know, part of one of her answers was engaging exactly that point, which was to say, you know, this is a, you know, some people in some communities in various different parts of the world experience apocalypse every day, like all the time. And you know, we were, in a lot of ways, the issue was trying to engage with like the kind of discourses around apocalypse and kind of trying to situate that. But that definitely kind of had the effect of like shifting my kind of perspective on that in a powerful way.
And Out of the Woods as well, the interview of Out of Woods in that, kind of on that quite early.
Yeah,
we'll really recommend. Yeah.
We'll be reading Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson's Rehearsals for Living, which I'll discuss this very similarly. And in that one, particularly in the context of the pandemic, but also with environmental catastrophe. Yeah, you know, obviously Indigenous populations in particular have experienced pandemics for centuries. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. Yeah, again, just if anybody else does have a question, do feel free to jump in, or we can ask more. We have plenty more. How are we doing for time? Yeah. Are you up for another question or two?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Tom, did you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on so much, so you've definitely touched on this already, but in terms of like unions in the colonial core, I guess my naivety before reading the book, I kind of figured the trade union, organized labor, sort of it almost like, you know, gave into the imperial state more sort of like as a transaction, as a compromise. I thought it, you know, they got some of the loot as a reward for embracing the colonial state. But from your book, I sort of see more of a deliberate and active role from organized labor in some senses, and then sort of bringing that into the present, you know, 100 years later or whatever, as we begin to see an uptick in union activity. Like, how would you conceive of the state of unions and organized labor today in their relationship to race, whiteness, the state, the mechanisms of coercion, or where might they be headed? If that makes any sort of sense as a question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, it's tough. I think you're probably right in terms of like that being your reading of the book. I think that is the history that we present, mainly in well, really in the chapters 4 to 7. So I think that the environment is being set by the kind of colonial state as well, and so you can't kind of you have to both give sort of due agency to white workers and white workers' institutions for in the histories that we tell in the late 19th and early 20th century, for actively choosing to reproduce sort of racial segregation, color bars, exclusion from unions, and outright kind of pogroms and racial violence, whilst also understanding the kind of relationship or the role of the state in kind of creating creating the context in which kind of racial logics utterly suffuse those societies and are reproduced with lots of power from on high, as well as kind of taken up from below. So it's obviously quite a it's a process where they're drawing on each other. In terms of today, I mean, it's racial exclusion within British unions does not operate in the way that it did in the post-war decades, and that's because of the struggle of Black and Asian workers. But you do have, I think Neha referenced Sivanandan, and he writes so cogently on kind of how the real sting of those autonomous anti-racist movements is kind of taken out of what once the kind of integration into the labor movement takes place, which is not like this kind of argument to say that just staying autonomous forever is the answer to everything, or that the denying that the kind of class ascension of sections of what was a kind of super exploited kind of racialized layer of the proletariat is like preferable because it's more radical. I mean, it's like the reality is that from the 70s, 80s, 90s, you had a larger Black and Asian middle class than you had before that, and that a lot of those people took part in the institutions of Britain in a way that they were previously segregated from, and that led to forms of social control over Black and Asian working class people, and it led to representation politics becoming more prominent, and it led to Black sections in the Labour Party, and these things were contested by working class Black movements at the time, rather than seeing them as like this natural progression of like the labor movement just like becoming less racist. Because obviously what happens is the immigration controls, which were legislated by Labour governments as much as Tory governments, and not just by new Labour governments but by old Labour governments, they created a kind of consensus white nationalist kind of immigration policy, and you have a kind of you have a kind of consensus among both the Labour Party and to a large extent the trade unions in the kind of 90s and noughties for a kind of a continuation of that immigration regime. So whilst there has been struggles within that have meant that there are kind of Black caucuses within the major unions and policies around, you know, against discrimination and things like that, the trade unions and the Labour Party are actively responsible for the closing of the gates in the first place, and in lots of different ways continue to exclude people who are, you know, who are unable to get certain, you know, unionized jobs. They don't represent people, or they shaft people, like happened with the Deliveroo drivers, and who are being organized by radical unions. And so they still take, I think, still partake in these kind of practices which help to continue British racial rule, even if you know, it's not as explicit as the colour bars that they operated in the past. So it's a new context, and obviously also all the ways in which trade unions continue to kind of support various industries of imperialism, industries that impoverish other parts of the world and things like that. So it's a kind of, yeah, it's a difficult.
I think that I'll be quick, so I'd like to, if there's other people want to come in on this, but I think the economism of trade unions is still very well sustained, and there is there kind of essentially a latent, if not explicit, allegiance to the state and capital accumulation and growth. And you see that, say, for example, a recent GMB leader, I forget his name, who said, yeah, well, fracking, you know, he should kind of be realistic about this. And I remember making an argument that, you know, if it will be going over somewhere else, it's almost kind of ethical to take it on board here, you know, that they just be fracking somewhere else, almost kind of like a weird kind of peculiar, or, you know, like quasi anti-imperialist argument that, you know, we should take responsibility for our own energy, you know, which is nationalist as well. So you've got that example. I think I've talked about the example before in other talks about the RMT, and, you know, you look at the strikes there and at the kind of sequence and momentum of those strikes. There's kind of really interesting coordinations. When those strikes started happening, you had the anti-deportation stuff that was going on with the Rwanda plan. You had like parts of Pride, like pull away and support picket. And there's these kind of collaborations that were taking place. And then as the Enough is Enough campaign, it started to get a national expression, less about strikes and more about a national campaign banner for essentially a rerun of the Corbynist kind of manifesto. And then you get Andy Burnham and Labour politicians, and there's these kind of collaborations, and a lot of the kind of radicalism of the Stop Shoot movements are involved in these strikes, and workers on the picket gets shaded out as part of a national campaign, an anti-austerity campaign, kind of reworked for the present context, with media figureheads who really argue for Britain to be saved. You know, like it goes back to kind of a national framing rather than a working class framing, which it emerged, which it kind of happened at first. And so I think there's always these tensions within Labourism, really, that kind of are maintained. And part of the reason that these unions are weakened, and they are very much weakened, is because of the incorporation in the past. And like you're saying, Dominic, those compromises, they are compromises still in a way. They're just kind of not passive. There's kind of active intention, really, to become part of an imperialist ascendancy, you know, an ascendancy in which the nation could have a popular movement of workers who are incorporated with that idea of whiteness, which was formerly about aristocratic elites and political elites. That idea, that kind of concept of whiteness broadened to allow kind of Labour to become part of that national progress. So we're not in an ascendancy, we're in a descent. So it's that's like, you know, one of the differences. So I feel that sometimes that is re-expressed as a nostalgia for a kind of strong workers movement, and one that's a kind of colourblind history of linear progress, of workers in unison with suffragettes and all other progressive movements towards this point, you know, trying to recapture that kind of stages line. And, you know, it's good to be aware that that's not the case, I think. So you can be realistic about what the prospects for social movements are now, and the strength, the actual strength of shop steward movements and stuff like that. But anyway, I'll stop there. I'm supposed to be short.
Thank you both. Yeah, I suppose essentially as last question, Yara has posted a good one to end on in the chat, and I hope other people might be able to contribute to with their ideas about.
Yeah.
So Yara has posted that she's interested in how you hope the left will engage with this book in an ideal world. What groups and people you're hoping read it, and how it might change them, and do you think they will? And I'd also just like to plug Yara's book, There Are More Things, which is an incredible read, and yeah, deals with some of the questions. And yeah, anyway, yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And again, I'd like, if you, anybody listening, have also thought about or have already discussed this book and even some of the questions around identity politics more broadly with other people, how do you see this book going down? But yeah, obviously first, Alex and Michael.
I'm kind of like conflicted, because the book's only just come out and I'm already like overwhelmed by just anyone kind of responding. I'm not used to, like, this is our first book, and like I don't think people have generally read very much of the things that I've written before, so it is a bit weird, the experience of suddenly like having a book out and knowing that people are reading it. Which doesn't mean I don't want people to read it, but I'm just conflicted about it. I don't know. I mean, I think that generally the way that these things work is that it tends to be people who are already kind of in your circles or in your same kind of political kind of slipstream that will tend to read it. I mean, I hope that it has a wide readership. That's what we worked with our editor on, in terms of trying to make it accessible and trying to make it for a kind of popular readership. In terms of, you know, how people, I don't have, you know, huge kind of pretensions about like changing people in huge ways. I hope I think the thing that would make me feel really proud and satisfied would be if people read the book and then went on and read lots of the kind of source material that we quote and that we reference, because like I think that it really is like this kind of guide to like so many of the best kind of, you know, anti-colonial and feminist and, you know, radical Jewish and you know, communist thinkers that we've read, and I think that would be great to know that had kind of set people on their way. Yeah, what do you think, Alex? You probably have a better.
No, I think the same really. I think one of the motivations early on was that it wanted to feel like a bridging text as well, that there was work in there which could link up to contemporary issues, discourses and problems certainly we face as part of social movements, and talk to people on the left, you know, not having any pretenses also to talk to a general kind of audience, you know, kind of we wanted to kind of engage certain problems that we thought were relevant to anybody who enters on the left, who's already on the left, and kind of contribute, you know, to a richer political culture, really, which is what we all want. And there's a lot of writers doing that. So we feel like one of many writers that are starting to do that. We certainly, you know,
so many great books out at the moment.
Yeah, and we, you know, so we certainly want to be kind of contribute something to that kind of momentum, really. And yeah, you know, be a bridging title to kind of other contemporary authors, to kind of reframing what new forms of abolitionist communism is, to kind of, I don't know, create some kind of, it's very difficult for movements that we're all in a sense, to have an institutional memory. I think a book can kind of provide something of that as well. Like it can provide legacies of movements which aren't idealized, which include the divisions that kind of formed the problems that we have. So I do find it, you know, that's the emphasis really. I don't think it's, some books are really important for kind of creating a drumbeat. I'm not sure, you know, for change and kind of more kind of imaginative visions of what to look for next. And I think our books are kind of looking back in a way for a kind of pause of reflection to kind of help that, to kind of support those other kind of thinkers and works that are kind of projecting forward, if you like. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that explains it, but certainly, you know, it's kind of, I feel it went in there with like humble intentions, if you know what I mean, for what it is. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it really.
I personally found it very similar to Bell Hooks' Ain't I a Woman in that way of addressing the kind of historical misconceptions and really thinking about how we got there. And I do think that does still serve some of that kind of future purpose, right? It's still kind of like, you know, so yeah, great. Again, if anybody else has any more reflections, would love to hear that. Yeah, Yara's just mentioned that she's going to get up for mum and dad. Genuinely, I thought the same thing for my parents, because, yeah, really kind of like interesting addressing, at least for my parents, some misconceptions they may have about previous movements. But yeah, great, thank you. Great. I suppose we will wrap it up there, unless anybody else has any more comments, but I just wanted to say thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Alex and Michael, for your time.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Likewise, that was great. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Dominic.
Yeah,
thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dominic.
Thanks all. Yeah, we will be holding some more events coming up in the future, so do feel free to, do keep an eye out, and hope to see you all again. And thanks again.
Okay, loads of love.
Bye.
Bye-bye.